The man known to history as Heinrich Himmler was born on the 7th of October 1900 in the German Bavarian city of Munich. His mother, Anna Maria Himmler, came from a traditional Catholic family and, as well as Heinrich, also parented two more boys, Gebhard Ludwig, born in 1898, and Ernst Hermann in 1905. Himmler's father, Joseph Gebhard Himmler, was a 35-year-old schoolmaster at the time of Heinrich's birth and had previously gained a degree in phonology and languages at Munich University, and afterwards was appointed to be the tutor of Prince Heinrich of Bavaria of the House of Wittelsbach, before returning to Munich as a professor and teacher. A proud, organised and pedantic man, Gebhard took great pride in his career success, which is evidenced by him collecting lavish furnishings to adorn the Himmler household, along with paintings and collectibles, including old German coins and memorabilia, meaning that both Heinrich and his brothers enjoyed a comfortable but traditional middle-class upbringing. Although Gebhard had proven himself to be a success, his father, Heinrich's grandfather, had been a poverty-stricken, lifelong soldier, and to start with at least, the Himmlers had survived thanks to the support of Anna's family in Regensburg, southeast Germany, as her father was a successful tradesman, who had enabled the family to move into a spacious second-floor apartment on the Hildegardstrasse in Munich, where Anna gave birth to her second son in 1900, who she and Gebhard named after his former student, Prince Heinrich, who also consented to become the young Himmler's godfather. As was typical of children their age and class within German society, the Himmler brothers received a strict, regimented upbringing that was only intensified by their mother's religious ardour and their father's occupation, and any hopes they may have had of escaping their parents' attention were soon ended, when all three were sent to a grammar school in Landshut, northeast of Munich, where their father was the joint schoolmaster. It was during this time in Landshut that the young Himmler began to take an interest in Germanic heritage and history in general, that had possibly been inspired by the Bavarian town's castles and countless centuries-old buildings, and after his son also showed a keen interest in his father's historical memorabilia, Gebhard went to every possible length to encourage Heinrich's newfound fascination, and in return, young Himmler returned his father's attention by becoming an obedient and devoted son. Over the coming months and years, Heinrich soon proved himself to be his father's son, as he became a hard-working, methodical, but quiet and unimaginative child, which is evidenced by the fragments of surviving diary he wrote in 1910, in which, instead of writing his daily accounts in sentences, he merely listed his trivial daily activities, such as a meal or bath times, and referred to any adults by their full name or title, giving the impression that from an early age, that Himmler was proper, organised, and fastidious. As Heinrich grew older, his diary entries became more descriptive, but remained periodical, the most notable of them recounting additions to his stamp collection or church services. However, after the outbreak of World War I, Himmler began to write about events or battles he had read about in the local press, as well as letters his father received from Prince Heinrich, who had joined the German army in 1901 as a lieutenant, and after the outbreak of war was badly wounded in action on the Western Front in 1914. It was during this period that Himmler began to prepare himself to join the German army, which was only a few years hence, by exercising regularly and lifting weights in an effort to gain muscle mass. But as much as young Himmler may have wanted to appear as a strong, youthful German, he during this period also complained of regular colds, stomach pains, and other illnesses that were a cause of near constant frustration and concern for him. At school, Heinrich proved himself to be a hard-working pupil who neither excelled nor failed at the various subjects he was expected to master, which included science, mathematics, history, geography, shorthand, Latin, and Greek, as well as piano lessons, which he showed little natural talent for, and after many years of failure, eventually plucked up enough courage to ask his parents to quit. From 1915 onwards, Himmler's diary entries began to subside in number, which may have been due to the death in 1916 of his godfather, Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, in the mountains of Romania, and although this undoubtedly was a severe blow for both Heinrich and his father, their reaction to the prince's death is not recorded, but it is probable that they were greatly affected by it. Possible evidence for what effect the prince's death may have had on Himmler's father then came in 1917, when his father wrote to the Bavarian royal household asking for his son to be considered as a future officer cadet, but not before he reached maturity, and in the meantime, Himmler was called up for training in 1917 at his mother's hometown of Regensburg with the 11th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. The next year, Himmler continued his army training, first as a machine gunner and then as an officer. However, despite his later claims that he saw action on the Western Front in World War I, records show that Heinrich never finished his army training before the end of hostilities, as he was discharged in December 1918 without completing his officer training course. Himmler's hopes of military service were then further hindered in the aftermath of World War I, as the German army was massively reduced in size, largely due to the terms of the Versailles Treaty, and also because the country's economy had been decimated as a consequence of the war, meaning that although Himmler still intended to join the military, he was, due to disarmament, forced to seek a civilian occupation instead. This then led to Himmler seeking employment on a farm as an apprentice near the city of Ingolstadt, where his father had taken a teaching position in 1919. However, whilst working there, he soon began to feel ill and was soon diagnosed as having contracted paratyphoid fever caused by salmonella poisoning that in turn was caused by ingesting unclean meat or water. On his doctor's advice, Himmler was told to steer clear of farm work for at least a year. However, he evidently wished to seek a career in farming at this time, as he then enrolled on an agronomy course at the Technical University of Munich in October of 1919, where he would study crop and soil types until 1922, during which time he joined a fencing fraternity and even received the badge of honor that was a fencing scar to his face. It was during this period that a large part of Himmler's time was spent at a student society named the Apollo Club that largely consisted of ex-soldiers and top graduates, whose president was a Jewish man named Abraham Hofner, and although he was at first polite to the society's Jewish members in public, it is clear that Himmler had already formed strong anti-Semitic views as he was involved in violent arguments at which he protested against their membership that soon earned him a reputation as a nationalistic militarist himself. All in all, Himmler's diary, as well as the accounts handed down to us by his fellow students, paint a picture of a methodical, even pedantic, traditional and morally upright young man, who seems to have taken his studies and church-going extremely seriously, and who took great pride in Germanic culture and traditions, whilst avoiding intimate relationships with young women, as he thought they should be protected and prevented from going astray due to temptation, and even told his brother Gebhard that he intended to remain a virgin until he was married. Then, on the 25th of January 1922, at a meeting of his rifle club, Himmler, by chance, met a man who would change his life and start a chain of events that would ultimately make him one of the most famous and indeed notorious men in human history. The person in question was Captain Ernst Röhm, who was one of the few officers that had been able to remain in the German army after the First World War, who Himmler described as being very friendly as well as pessimistic about communism within Bavaria. This meeting is considered to be the first hard evidence of Himmler becoming involved in organised nationalistic politics, as it is evident that he was greatly impressed by the army captain, as after concluding his agricultural studies in August 1922, both he and his brother Gerhard in early 1923 joined Rome's newly formed nationalistic paramilitary unit named the Bund Reichskriegsflagge, or Imperial War Flag Society. Although he had now become involved with Rome and his paramilitary group, Himmler still sought work after leaving college, and as his studies had also covered chemistry, or rather the chemistry of fertilizers, he soon got a job as a fertilizer laboratory assistant in the municipality of Schleißheim, around 10 miles north of Munich, thusly meaning he was able to continue his membership of the Reichskriegsflagge. It is probable that it was around this time that Himmler would have become aware of the growing influence of the Munich-based National Socialist German Workers' Party, formerly the German Workers' Party, that since the 29th of July 1921 had been led by a certain Adolf Hitler, whose rabble-rousing, bombastic speeches within Munich's beer halls were attracting the admiration of the local nationalists, including Ernst Röhm, as well as the hatred of the communists, resulting in regular street battles breaking out between the two. It was also around this time that support for the nationalists within Germany was beginning to grow, as in 1923, the country's economy had been further damaged by the onset of hyperinflation that it had been experiencing since the First World War, but was now compounded by the fact that the German government had undertaken massive debts in order to pay for its war reparations under the Versailles Treaty, and as Germany had to repay these reparations with foreign currency, the country's government then began to buy foreign currency en masse by printing massive quantities of paper German marks that consequently made the country's currency more and more worthless. Then, as the value of the mark fell, more marks were needed to pay for foreign currency, meaning that eventually the German government in 1922 failed to pay the French one of their scheduled reparation installments, and as a result, the French government ordered the occupation of the industrial Ruhr region of Western Germany, after which it seized large amounts of German industrial output, including coal, that the German population desperately needed to heat their homes, and to make things worse, prices of foodstuffs such as bread skyrocketed due to hyperinflation, meaning that a loaf of bread in 1923 cost a staggering 200 billion marks. This dire situation was of direct benefit to the nationalists and the communists, whose support were now beginning to grow, due to the increasing discontentment and unemployment leading to yet more civil unrest and street fights. Therefore, in an effort to strengthen their forces, the Bavarian nationalist societies, including Ernst Röhm's Reichskriegsflagge, agreed to transfer the power of their organizations to Adolf Hitler on the 25th of September 1923, forming the Kampfbund, after which Hitler announced that he would hold 14 more mass meetings in Munich beginning on the 27th of September. As it was clear that the National Socialist Party was becoming the dominant force of the Bavarian right, Himmler joined the party a month before Hitler's formal takeover of the separate right-wing paramilitary groups, although he still remained a member of Ernst Röhm's Reichskriegsflagge unit, and thusly a subordinate of Röhm, whose final downfall he would in little over a decade have a crucial hand in bringing about. In the meantime, the Reichskriegsflagge, with Himmler in tow, took part in Hitler's failed beer hall putsch attempt on the 8th and 9th of November 1923, in which the National Socialists, the SA, and the Kampfbund attempted to seize control of the Bavarian government by capturing its leaders, including Gustav von Kahr, before marching on Berlin, much in the same way that Hitler's hero, Benito Mussolini, had seized the Italian government with his march on Rome the year before. This attempt ultimately ended in failure, however, when the First World War general, Erich Ludendorff, who had joined the putsch attempt alongside Hitler, released von Kahr and his allies from custody, and after Hitler and his supporters attempted to march through Munich the following day to link up with Röhm and Himmler's Reichskriegsflagge, they were met by government troops who opened fire on the nationalists and forced them to retreat. After attempting to go into hiding, Hitler was subsequently arrested and tried for high treason in February of 1924 and was given 5 years in prison at Landsberg, along with several other ringleaders of the putsch, including Rudolf Hess, but in contrast, Ludendorff, who was still a war hero, was released without charge, whilst Himmler, after being arrested, was released due to lack of evidence, although his involvement in the putsch lost him his job, and as the Nazi Party and SA was now banned, he was now forced to return home to his parents. Although Hitler's beer hall putsch had ended in humiliating failure, Himmler still maintained contact with Ernst Röhm, who had been incarcerated himself at Stadelheim prison, where Himmler visited him in February 1924 on his motorcycle, shortly before Röhm was released on probation, whilst Hitler, still at Landsberg, wrote his infamous autobiography and political doctrine Mein Kampf, after which he decided to seek power in Germany via peaceful means instead of revolution, before being released on the 20th of December 1924. Ernst Röhm, on the other hand, was now trying to reform more paramilitary groups with a view to seizing power by force, and it was because of this that a rift soon grew between him and Hitler, until out of contempt for what he thought was weakness on the Führer's part, Röhm resigned from all his party commitments on the 1st of May 1925, before travelling to Bolivia, where he took a position as an advisor to the country's armed forces. In contrast to Röhm, it is clear that Himmler had no intention of giving up his nationalist political activities, as he refused to look for work during this period, much to his parents' displeasure, and instead became a campaigner for the newly formed National Socialist Freedom Movement, which was effectively the National Socialist Party under a different name, as it had been banned after the putsch, and during the 1925 elections, the party managed to secure 32 seats, half of which they would lose during another election within a matter of months. During the campaign, Himmler toured Bavaria's towns and villages, making speeches on the evils of capitalism as well as the Jews, but despite his activism, when Ernst Röhm left Germany for Bolivia, Himmler was left without a powerful friend, through which he could make himself known. But when Hitler was released from Landsberg prison, new life was breathed back into the National Socialist cause, leading Himmler to rejoin the newly renamed party on the 2nd of August 1925, after which Himmler, who was now aged 24, joined a staff of Gregor and Otto Strasser as a general assistant who during Hitler's imprisonment had done more than most to keep the movement alive. After assuming this position, Himmler soon became indispensable to Gregor Strasser, whose brother, Otto, would recall how Himmler was doubly useful as he had a motorbike, and because Himmler had rapid transport, he was placed in charge of checking the various arms dumps the Nazi Party had built up around Bavaria and ensuring that they were not discovered by the government. During 1925, whilst assisting in the party organisation within Lower Bavaria, Himmler also helped to edit the party's local folk journal, in which he, in his own words, named and shamed all Jewish persons living in Bavaria, along with those he judged, rightly or wrongly, to be their friends, leading to some within the party to question whether Himmler was becoming obsessed with the Jews, to which his boss, Gregor Strasser, replied that although his assistant was loyal, he had no intention of facilitating his promotion as he thought that Himmler, despite being ambitious, was no world beater, although his diligence did eventually earn Himmler promotion to become Strasser's deputy within Bavaria shortly afterwards. It was around this time that Himmler also joined a seemingly obscure bodyguard unit within the National Socialist Party, named the Schutzstaffel, or SS, that owed its formation to being the latest in a succession of personal bodyguard units to the Führer, as Hitler had entertained the idea of forming an elite personal protection squad from amongst the ranks of the SA, or Sturmabteilung, which was the paramilitary arm of the Nazi Party, largely because in the aftermath of the First World War, there were as many as 380 political assassinations within Germany. These prototype bodyguard units were short-lived, however, as they were disbanded in the aftermath of Hitler's failed beer hall putsch, but after the Führer's release, had been reformed in March of 1925, and after being renamed several times, the title Protection Squadron, or Schutzstaffel, was decided upon in November that year. But although the SS was set up to give Hitler close protection, it was still subordinate and part of the SA. Despite this, the SS members from its earliest days saw themselves as an elite unit within the SA, as its members wore caps with the Prussian Totenkopf skull and crossbones, as well as a field grey uniform, differing considerably from the brown-shirted SA members, whose own uniforms originated in the early 1920s, when the Nazis had procured thousands of surplus brown tropical German army uniforms. But despite already having different clothing from the main body of the SA, the SS would soon adopt the notorious black German army-style uniforms with peaked caps and polished boots, which would become the unit's trademark in the years to come and truly mark them out as the elite force within Nazi Germany. Nonetheless, it was perhaps out of a desire to stand out or satisfy his long-held ambition of becoming a soldier that prompted Himmler to join the SS, in which he was given the rank of SS Führer, or SS Leader, which may have been an attraction for him, along with the membership number 168, and a year later, in 1926, Himmler was promoted within the SS, under its new head, Joseph Berchtold, to be a SS Gauführer, or district leader within Lower Bavaria. However, Berchtold soon resigned as SS leader in 1927 and was replaced by the young Reinhard Heydrich. By this time, Himmler was proving himself to be an ambitious, hard-working, and devoted member of the National Socialist Party, although he was not seen as having a particularly bright future, whereas the likes of Joseph Goebbels, who worked with Himmler during this period in Bavaria, was seen as a rising star within the party, although Goebbels remarked in his diary that he liked Himmler, calling him intelligent and a good fellow, who often gave him lifts on his motorcycle to party events. It is clear that until 1926, Himmler was a mere functionary rather than a leader within the Nazi Party, as his salary was a modest 120 marks a month, and his SS duties largely consisted of canvassing members of the Bavarian public to subscribe to the party newspaper, as well as securing advertisements. However, Himmler's diligence soon prompted Gregor Strasser to promote him in 1926 to become deputy propaganda chief within Bavaria, in which role he worked closely with Joseph Goebbels. It is likely that during this period, Himmler first came to the Führer Adolf Hitler's attention, as he was, after all, based in Bavaria, where he was steadily becoming an important figure within the party. However, it is not known exactly when Himmler and Hitler first met, although there are accounts which state that Himmler held a meeting with Hitler in September of 1927, in which he told the Führer of his idea to turn the insignificant SS into the elite paramilitary unit of the National Socialist Party, and evidently being impressed by this, Hitler promoted Himmler to become deputy SS leader under Reinhard Heydrich and the rank of SS Oberführer, or SS senior leader. By this time, the membership of the SA numbered in the tens of thousands, whilst the SS membership had declined from around 1,000 to under 300 under Reinhard Heydrich's leadership, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to outshine his superior, Himmler now showed his characteristic bureaucratic ability by initiating a reorganization of the SS and setting up separate jurisdictions across Germany that soon made it clear that he was far more able than his SS superior, who he began to eclipse and upstage. It was during this period that the Nazi Party as a whole was beginning to expand its reach beyond its homeland to Bavaria, meaning that the attention or focus of its campaigning increasingly centered around Berlin, resulting in Himmler, in 1927, embarking on a lecture tour in the German capital, where he met his future wife, a 34-year-old nurse named Margareta Boden, who owned a nursing home within Berlin and was, according to accounts, of Polish heritage. Himmler, who was 27 years old at this time, clearly formed a close bond with Margareta, as like him she was fastidious, hard-working, and shared his anti-Semitism, and although the details of their relationship are sparse, Margareta was evidently rather taken with the young Bavarian, as only a few months after their first meeting, she sold her nursing home, bought a chicken farm near Munich, and finally married Himmler in July of 1928. The following year of 1929 would prove to be one of the most important of Himmler's life, as in August both he and Margareta greeted their only daughter Gudrun into the world. But earlier that year, an equally significant event had occurred when, due to poor performance, combined with Himmler's good performance, Reinhard Heydrich was dismissed as leader of the SS by Hitler and replaced by the 28-year-old Himmler as Obergruppenführer, or senior group leader of the SS, and despite the fact Himmler is known today as Reichsführer SS, this title was not officially given to him until 1934, although Himmler still addressed himself as Reichsführer SS, or Realm Leader, from 1929 regardless. Although the SS was tiny compared to the SA in 1929, its primary role of guarding top party officials now gave Himmler direct access to the very top of the National Socialist Party, and it is clear that Himmler's vision to transform the SS into an elite Praetorian Guard-like force met with Hitler's approval from the very beginning of his leadership, meaning that the young office clerk from Bavaria could effectively mold his unit into what he saw as the very ideal of Germanic warriors, whose loyalty, racial purity, physical fitness, and courage were surpassed by none and feared by all. In the meantime, whilst Nazi popularity soared in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, Hitler soon became one of the most high-profile political leaders within Germany, along with Hermann Goering and the now propaganda head of the Nazi Party, Joseph Goebbels, whilst Himmler in contrast remained in the background, continuing his earlier habit, or strategy, of quietly accumulating power and expanding the membership of his SS from 300 in 1929 to 3,000 in 1930. Despite the National Socialist popularity increasing in the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler's strategy of securing power via peaceful means was increasingly at odds with the SA leadership, who were still in favour of seizing power by force, as they far outnumbered the German army by this stage, and this groundswell of agitation was now increasingly causing Hitler problems, as he could not convince the German public, as well as the army and parliament or Reichstag, that he was a viable leader, whilst his own party members were increasingly becoming a law unto themselves. The German parliament was at this time in a state of flux, or rather chaos itself, as in 1930 the Social Democratic government fell, largely as a result of disputes within the Reichstag over employer contributions of unemployment insurance, leading to an election being held in September in which the Social Democratic Party failed to win a majority, leading to Hitler's National Socialists securing the second largest number of seats with over 6 million votes, and as he was a figure of some importance by this stage, Himmler was selected to become a member or deputy of the German parliament himself. Then around the time of the 1930 election, a group of SA leaders, led by Walter Stennis, who had grown tired of Hitler's political campaigning, staged the so-called Stennis Revolt, in which they issued a list of demands, including a resumption of street attacks on communists and Jews, as well as 3 places on the ballot paper for the up-and-coming elections, which Hitler rejected out of hand, telling Stennis to, quote, "get lost," prompting the Berlin SA members to trash the party's regional headquarters in response. After arriving in Berlin and taking control of the SA in person and quelling the unrest, Hitler then sent a personal appeal to Ernst Röhm, who was still in Bolivia, who after returning to Germany took up his new position as Chief of Staff of the SA in January of 1931. But as the SA's loyalty had now come into question, Heinrich Himmler's SS now acted as bodyguards to all top Nazi officials and increasingly became the party's internal police force, whilst the SA under Röhm's leadership became more militaristic and radical, which would over the coming years put it at odds with the German army, government, and Adolf Hitler himself. At the beginning of 1931, Heinrich Himmler began setting up a counterintelligence division of the SS, one of the candidates for which was an unemployed former Navy cadet and champion fencer named Reinhard Heydrich, who Himmler interviewed on his small holding and was evidently so impressed by that he hired Heydrich on the spot and in 1932 made him head of the newly named SD, or Sicherheitsdienst, meaning security service, that would in the hands of Heydrich come to act as the covert espionage and surveillance arm of the SS. As the election of 1930 had ended in no party gaining a majority, a Social Democrat coalition was formed but soon collapsed in 1932, leading to two further elections being held, in which the National Socialists gained a majority in July, but lost it again 6 months later in another election. And as no one party could form a government, Germany's political elite were forced to consider offering the Nazis a place in the coalition, prompting leading politicians to write to the head of state, Paul von Hindenburg, recommending he appoint Hitler as leader, culminating in Adolf Hitler being made Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933. After this, Hitler immediately sought to claim total control of the country by asking Hindenburg to dissolve the German parliament so that fresh elections could be held in March of 1933. However, in February, the Reichstag caught fire and burned to the ground, after which Hindenburg, at Hitler's insistence, enacted the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended all basic civil rights and allowed detention without trial, and afterwards an enabling act was passed, which gifted Hitler de facto control over Germany for the period of 4 years and enabled him to pass laws without the consent of the country's parliament, making him the de facto dictator of Germany. By 1933, Heinrich Himmler's SS membership had ballooned in size to over 50,000 members, all of whom were now subject to strict entry rules involving ancestry, physical fitness, and height checks to ensure only the most Nordic-looking Germans gained admission to Himmler's elite force. Whilst on the flip side, those within the Third Reich who were deemed to be undesirable soon began to feel the full implications of Himmler's planned purge of the German people. The first stage of this was the setting up of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office that was tasked with maintaining high entry standards for SS members. That was augmented in December 1931 when Himmler gave the so-called marriage order that required SS members who sought to marry to produce a full family tree dating back to at least 1800, and if those in question were deemed to be of sufficiently pure heritage, they were expected to parent as many children as possible in order to further increase Germany's Aryan stock. In conjunction with instigating measures designed to ensure the purity of the SS membership, Himmler, after Hitler's rise to power in 1933, also began to adopt other measures to contain and even persecute those he considered to be of impure blood, or enemies of the burgeoning Nazi state, by setting up the first concentration camps, such as Dachau, that were initially designed to hold those the Nazis wanted to contain, which, along with Germany's established prisons, were now used by the new government to indefinitely detain and even execute political prisoners, including Himmler's former boss and leader of the SS, Reinhard Heydrich, who was arrested and murdered in 1933 by agents of Heydrich's SD. Back in Berlin, only two obstacles now stood between Adolf Hitler and absolute power in Germany, one of which was Hindenburg, who was still technically his superior, whilst the second was the army, or rather the Army High Command, who were now increasingly voicing their concerns regarding the power of Ernst Röhm's now massive SA. For some time, Hitler and other Nazi leaders had become concerned that Röhm was planning to seize power himself, as by 1933, the SA now numbered in the region of 3 million men, dwarfing the 100,000 strong German army, and to make matters worse, Röhm was becoming increasingly arrogant and insulting to Hitler himself, even publicly stating that if revolution did not come, the Führer would have to go. In 1933, Hermann Goering, who was now Minister-President of Prussia, formed a new covert branch of the region's police force, named the Geheime Staatspolizei, or Gestapo. However, after he became increasingly concerned that its leadership was not ruthless enough to contain the SA, Goering reached an agreement with Himmler in April of 1934 to hand over the control of the Gestapo to the SS chief, who then placed it in Reinhard Heydrich's capable hands, after which Hitler further rewarded Himmler by placing him in charge of all Germany's police forces outside of Prussia, meaning that he now had control over the close protection of the Nazi elite, Germany's secret services, and the majority of the country's conventional police forces. In little under 5 years, Heinrich Himmler had gone from relative obscurity as a Nazi party clerk in Lower Bavaria to gaining control of the interior of virtually the entire German state. However, one last threat to his position still had to be dealt with, that being the SA, and the man who had introduced him to the National Socialist movement in the first place, Ernst Röhm. By this time in June of 1934, Hitler had already decided that Röhm and the SA leadership had to be eliminated, and thusly, plans were then set in motion, with Hitler's approval, to permanently muzzle the SA, in an operation codenamed Hummingbird, which was headed by Hermann Goering, along with Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. When all was ready, Hummingbird was then carried out by the SS from the 30th of June to the 2nd of July in 1934, in which arrests were made throughout the country, leading to over 100 of Hitler's political enemies, including Ernst Röhm, being arrested and executed without trial. And as the SA leadership had now been eliminated, the door was wide open for Himmler's SS to expand its remit even further across Germany. The year after the so-called Night of the Long Knives, as Operation Hummingbird is now known, in September of 1935, anti-Semitism in Germany reached new levels when Hitler, who was now head of state after the death of Paul von Hindenburg the year before, introduced the so-called Nuremberg laws, which forbade marriage between Jews and non-Jews across Germany, and even deprived non-Aryans of German citizenship, which marked the beginning of an increasingly severe series of governmental measures designed to persecute non-Aryans, that would eventually culminate in what many consider to be one of the most infamous periods of mass murder in human history. In the meantime, Himmler's power over the interior of the Third Reich hit even greater heights in June of 1936, when Hitler decreed the unification of all state police forces within Germany, and thusly named Himmler as head of all state police forces, effectively bringing them under the umbrella of the SS as a result. Now that the SS controlled Germany's police forces and secret services, Himmler, perhaps in an effort to fulfill his dream of a military career, began the formation of a new fighting arm of the SS, which would eventually become the infamous Waffen-SS, or Armed SS, whose origins can be found as early as 1933, when the so-called SS Sonderkommando was formed in Berlin under Sepp Dietrich, that initially acted as an elite bodyguard unit to Adolf Hitler, pledging allegiance and obedience to him until death. However, after the 10th anniversary of Hitler's Beer Hall Putsch in 1933, this unit was renamed the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, effectively making it the Führer's elite paramilitary bodyguard, and a year later in 1934, Himmler renamed it as the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, as he wanted it to be clear that the unit was comprised of SS members and was not part of the German armed forces. The Leibstandarte would eventually form the first of 38 Waffen-SS divisions, each consisting of around 20,000 elite troops, many of which were comprised of nationalities from Germany's captured territories, including the 5th SS Panzer Viking Division, which was comprised of men from Scandinavia, whilst the 13th Waffen Mountain Division consisted of Bosnians, Slavs and Croatians, that along with other SS divisions comprised of French, Belarusian, Flemish, Hungarian, Dutch, as well as Latvian troops, eventually gave the Waffen-SS a total manpower of 900,000 men during World War II. As well as this, the Waffen-SS also boasted a number of panzer divisions that were equipped with the very latest German tanks, making the dreaded SS Panzer divisions amongst the most effective units of the entire Second World War, as they were given the very best equipment Nazi Germany possessed, such as Tiger tanks, whilst their troops were amongst the most fanatical and loyal Himmler's SS had to offer. Despite their fighting prowess, the Waffen-SS would go on to commit numerous war crimes during World War II, in countries such as Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, including Oradour-sur-Glane in the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region of France, in which 642 French civilians, including women and children, were massacred by the 2nd SS Panzer Division, along with the Wormhout Massacre of May 1940, where 80 Allied prisoners of war were shot by men from the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Although Himmler is well known as being the head of Nazi Germany's police and intelligence services, A less known aspect of his character is his fascination with Nordic mythology, as there are records of him approving expeditions and research projects to find ancient relics, as well as evidence of the existence of pagan Germanic cultures before the spread of Christianity, which he believed to be a threat to the morality of the German-speaking peoples. These included a wide array of obscure and even fanciful projects and expeditions, such as sending German scientists to Japan to ascertain if there were any geological links between the Asian and Germanic people, whilst Himmler also sought evidence from archaeological and research projects across Europe and beyond, in an attempt to prove the superiority of the Aryan race, and historians also summarise that it was Himmler's intention to replace Christianity altogether in Germany, as Jesus, after all, was a Jew. This replacement of Christianity was also manifested in the SS itself, by its members having to renounce their faith for the new SS pseudo-religion, which consisted of Christmas being replaced by winter solstice festivals and Christian weddings being changed to pagan ceremonies, devised by Himmler himself, who then in 1933 bought a castle at Wagelsburg that he initially intended to become an SS training centre, but soon had made into a venue for hosting SS dinners and pagan ceremonies. An example of Himmler's reverence for Nordic history and mythology is the SS logo itself, which was designed by an SS graphic designer named Walter Heck in 1933 and consisted of two Scandinavian Sig runes that originally represented the sun. However, these were interpreted in error in 19th century Germany to meaning victory, as the German word for victory is Sieg. Therefore, the infamous SS logo not only stands for Schutzstaffel, but is also supposed to mean victory. Indeed, the cry of Sieg Heil was soon adopted by the masses during Hitler's rallies, in which they would give the Nazi salute whilst crying Sieg Heil, meaning victory, hail. In the lead up to World War II, Adolf Hitler expanded the Third Reich by means of annexing his homeland of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, and to ensure that the subjugation of both countries was brought about as quickly as possible, special units were formed consisting of SS and Gestapo operatives, who were given the title of Einsatzkommando, that were tasked with arresting all persons deemed to be a threat to the new order, as well as securing public buildings and bringing local police forces under their remit. These units were normally under the control of Himmler's right-hand man, Reinhard Heydrich, and would later in the war form the dreaded Einsatzgruppen units of the SS, that were tasked with hunting down and eliminating resistance groups, Jews, and all those deemed to be a threat by the Nazis during World War II, resulting in later massacres such as Baba Yar in September of 1941, in which some 33,000 Jews were executed by the SS in the Ukraine, along with numerous other mass killings in the Baltic states and the Soviet Union itself. We know these massacres took place, as a detailed SS report was found after the war that had been sent by the commander of Einsatzgruppen A, Franz Walter Stahlecker, to Reinhard Heydrich in January of 1942, that detailed the number of Jews that had been killed by his unit since the start of the German invasion, and even included a map listing the exact number of Jews killed in each of the Baltic states, which totaled over 220,000 men, women, and children. The total number of Jews estimated to have been killed by SS Einsatzgruppen death squads during World War II between 1941 and 1945 is around 1.3 million, involving women and children often being shot at point-blank range. However, the sheer logistics of exterminating the Jews by these methods, combined with the psychological effects on SS soldiers, would soon prompt Himmler and Heydrich to turn the extermination of the Jews into a modern industrialized process. As the borders of Hitler's Third Reich expanded, so too did the responsibilities of Himmler's SS, as the organisation was responsible for policing the interior of the Third Reich, and as entire nations such as France were now being brought under Nazi jurisdiction, the number of SS personnel ballooned along with it, in order to cope with the challenge. After failing to cross the English Channel and invade Britain in 1940, Hitler ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union the following year, with Operation Barbarossa, which was designed to eradicate what Hitler and Himmler saw as the Bolshevik Jewish Soviet Union, and create Lebensraum, or living space for the ethnic Germans, thusly starting the Germanization of Eastern Europe, laying the foundations for the so-called Thousand-Year Reich. In the lead up to the invasion, Himmler was given the responsibility of preparing the SS for Operation Barbarossa, in which he was tasked with bringing the Eastern territories under Nazi administration, but after the outbreak of hostilities, the SS were overwhelmed with as many as 6 million Soviet prisoners of war, 50% of whom, in direct contravention of the Geneva Convention, were shot, gassed or starved to death by the Germans up until 1945. These massive numbers, combined with the hundreds of thousands of Jews that had been rounded up by this time, presented Himmler and the SS with a massive number of prisoners, and in an attempt to contain the huge numbers of people now under their charge, in Poland, areas of the country's inner cities were walled off and populated with the country's Jews, the most famous of which were the Warsaw and Krakow ghettos, whilst options for the final solution to the Jewish question were considered. Then in August of 1941, Himmler travelled eastward to Minsk, where he attended the executions of an unknown number of Jews, but as he observed the firing and the corpses dropping into pre-prepared graves, Himmler was deeply affected, leading to his chief of staff, Karl Wolff, to later state, "After many volleys, I could see that Himmler was trembling. He ran his hand across his face as he swayed. His face was almost green, and he immediately threw up and complained that a piece of brain had splattered his face, after which he ordered his subordinates to, quote, devise a less gruesome means of mass execution rather than just shooting people." This change in policy with regard to the mass executions would lead to experiments being undertaken in which Jews were killed in the rear of sealed vans by means of exhaust gases. However, these experiments were still considered to be inefficient, and thusly, plans were drawn up on Himmler's orders in early 1942 for gas chambers to be added to existing concentration camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau in southern Poland. These plans were formulated by Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, who on the 20th of January 1942 summoned Nazi party officials from various departments to attend the Wannsee conference, where he outlined the SS plan for the so-called total solution of the Jewish question in territories under German control, through the coordination of the government departments, which both Heydrich and Himmler were authorized to carry out by Hermann Goering on the 31st of July 1941. It is known what was discussed at this meeting, as a transcript belonging to one of the delegates, named Martin Luther, survived the war, which clearly describes the estimated number of Jews who were expected to be killed, which totaled around 11 million, along with the various criteria of who was to be considered Jewish or otherwise. However, in the transcript, evasive language was used which described the fate of the Jews as being evacuation rather than extermination. It is clear that by the spring of 1942, the plans for the final solution had been finalised and were ready to be put into effect, but the Holocaust's instigator, Reinhard Heydrich, would never see the final solution become reality, as he died of sepsis on the 4th of June 1942, after two Allied trained Czechoslovak agents attacked him in his chauffeur-driven car in Prague on the 27th of May, leading to thousands of Czech citizens being murdered in reprisal. After Heydrich's death, Himmler took personal command of the final solution, along with Heydrich's deputy, Adolf Eichmann, which he soon escalated in the so-called Operation Reinhard, named in Heydrich's honour, between 1941 and 1943, in which around 2 million of Poland's Jews were exterminated at purpose-built camps such as Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. The most notorious of the Nazi concentration camps was, of course, Auschwitz, which Himmler ordered to be expanded in early 1942, with the addition of gas chambers and furnaces, where Jews, Romani gypsies, homosexuals, along with all those deemed to be undesirable by the Nazis, were killed using a pesticide called Zyklon B, after which their bodies were incinerated. Despite few recorded documents remaining that specifically relate to the Nazi extermination of the Jews, perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came from the mouth of Heinrich Himmler himself, as on the 4th of October 1943, during a secret meeting with SS officers in the now Polish city of Poznan, Himmler expressly referred to the evacuation of the Jews that had been outlined at the Wannsee conference in 1942 as actually meaning their extermination.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein, und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das fasst Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeiten.
Despite some claiming that this audio recording does not contain the voice of Heinrich Himmler, later audio recordings of separate speeches he made in 1944 do confirm that the audio of the Posen speeches, as they are known, are without a doubt the voice of Heinrich Himmler, and thusly conclusively prove that the Third Reich's persecution of the Jews and implementation of the final solution did take place. Whilst this, combined with the testimonies of Himmler's chief of staff Karl Wolff, Adolf Eichmann, the previously mentioned Einsatzgruppen reports, as well as thousands of eyewitness testimonies, form a damning and irrefutable compendium of evidence. Further evidence that verifies Himmler's speeches comes from the pages of Joseph Goebbels' diary on the 9th of October 1943, in which he states, regarding the Jewish question, he, Himmler, gives a very unadorned and frank picture. He is of the conviction that the Jewish question can be solved by the end of this year. He advocates the most radical and most severe solution, namely, to exterminate Jewry, bag and baggage. Of course, if brutal, this is a consistent solution, because we must take on the responsibility of entirely solving the question in our time. By 1944, it was evident that Hitler's attempt to secure European domination had failed, which was evidenced by the massive reversals suffered by the German army in the Soviet Union, as well as D-Day, and in response, Hitler ordered the creation of new army units, consisted of every able-bodied man the German state could muster, resulting in Himmler finally realizing his childhood dream of becoming a soldier by being appointed as commander of Army Group Upper Rhine in the winter of 1944. As well as this, Hitler ordered Himmler to facilitate the creation of the so-called Volkssturm units, which were little more than armed civilians or militia, in the desperate hope of holding back the advancing Allied and Soviet forces. Nonetheless, these units, although nearly 500,000 strong, largely consisted of teenagers as well as pensioners who were equipped with makeshift weapons, and despite their best efforts, they were unable to offer much resistance against the Soviets, who in many cases just swept them aside. As the noose was tightened around the neck of the Third Reich, Himmler attempted to initiate peace negotiations through Swedish representatives by arranging with the World Jewish Congress for the release of some 20,000 Jews to Scandinavia, and later, on the 23rd of April 1945, Himmler also met with Count Bernadotte, head of the Swedish Red Cross, and despite the fact that Hitler was still alive, sent a written proposal to the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, offering Germany surrender to the Western Allies. That was promptly refused. A few days later, Himmler's peace offer was broadcast by the British Broadcasting Corporation on the 28th of April 1945, and after discovering that his loyal Heinrich, as he called him, had betrayed him, Hitler flew into a rage, stripped Himmler of all his offices and titles, and issued a warrant for his arrest, before committing suicide on the 30th of April 1945 in the Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin. As Berlin had capitulated and the majority of Germany was overrun, Himmler then sought to go into hiding by masquerading as an ordinary German soldier. However, whilst travelling through the German countryside west of Hamburg, Himmler and his comrades were detained at a checkpoint by former Soviet prisoners of war, and after spending several days in internment camps, was brought to a British civilian interrogation centre near Lüneburg on the 23rd of May. During an interview, Himmler openly admitted who he was, and was then transferred to British Second Army headquarters in Lüneburg, where a doctor began a medical examination, but when the physician attempted to look in Himmler's mouth, he resisted, and a few seconds later, collapsed onto the floor, and despite efforts to revive him, died 15 minutes later, from biting a potassium cyanide capsule, and shortly afterwards, the former Reichsfuhrer's body was interred in an unmarked grave near Lüneburg, the location of which remains a mystery to this day. In his 44 years of life, Heinrich Himmler went from being the dutiful son of a schoolteacher and a lowly member of a fringe nationalist group, to becoming the head of all police and security services within Nazi Germany, and finally becoming one of the architects of one of the largest mass killings in human history. Despite his unassuming and quiet manner, Heinrich Himmler is widely considered to have, at least in part, masterminded the details and implementation of the Holocaust, and although shocking and even horrifying, it is essential that we learn about his life, as well as the final solution itself, in all its appalling detail, as if we forget the mistakes of history, we ourselves are surely doomed to repeat them.